law at the University of California at Irvine, and I'm the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. I'm currently the independent chair of the board of the Global Network Initiative. Today, for the next hour, we're going to be speaking to, frankly, three friends of mine who, I mean, that's the least of their accomplishments, right? They are really eminent people in the space of human rights, of online rights, of the intersection of business and human rights, and many, many other things. And they are also three members of the Facebook Oversight Board, inaugural members of the board who've been involved for the past year, beginning with the training and orientation that they went through last year, through all of the different issues that many of you will be familiar with that they've addressed over the last several months. And I'm really just delighted to have them here. This we've designed as a kind of free-flowing conversation. And what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists, each of our oversight board members, the same kind of question to start, and then we'll just drill down into a number of issues. After we go for maybe 30, 35 minutes, or actually throughout this time, if you have any questions, please post them. We'll look at them and we'll be able to integrate them into our conversation as well. So, so the first question that I want to ask, and I'm going to start with Nigat Dad, and many of you are probably familiar with Nigat, who has been coming to RightsCon for probably many, many years, founded the Digital Rights Foundation in Pakistan, and is a well-known human rights defender, highly regarded, really a leader, not just in Pakistan, but around the world on issues of freedom of expression and other rights online, the intersection of rights and online space. So Nigat, I want to start with you. And the question that I'm going to ask each of your co-panelists and board members as well is, you know, you came into this process of the board with a real significant amount of knowledge about how the platforms mediate rights, and you know how they serve as either gatekeepers or, in a way, barriers, perhaps, to the enjoyment of rights. And going in, I mean, it must have taken quite a bit of thinking about whether you would join. I wonder if you have if there's been anything surprising, and maybe I'll put it this way. What were your expectations about the board going in? And what has been surprising, maybe one or two issues or simply activities or decisions that have been surprising to you over the last year?
Well, thank you so much, David, for having me on a panel and with such a kind introduction. I would say that when I was offered to be part of the board, I'll be very honest. I was, I took a great amount of time to think about that because of my role as a digital rights activist who have been, like very vocal around tech giants policies, especially when it comes to global South context, our context, different issues that we have been facing in our countries. But at the same time, I think I was also like tired of, pushing the companies to make changes in their policies or, do more about the issues that we have been raising from our part of the world. And I was like, why not, I should become part of the space where I also have a power to make decisions. And I think that's most of the time, I as an activist in Pakistan, like we fight for such kind of spaces. Although there was a, considerable amount of discussion. I mean, I was also worried about my own, like work that I have done over the past few years, several years, and was worried that what if it doesn't, turn out the way I'm thinking? But I would say that since I joined the board, there has been a huge amount of work that has gone into making this board as an institution. I'm sure that my co-panelists will agree to this because the kind of labor we are putting into this sort of experiment of self-regulation successful, I think that's just that's a huge amount of work. And the one thing that you asked me that's surprising for me, this is not a traditional board. It's like, it's an institution that is in the making. So I'll end here, and then over to you.
Great, Nigat. I mean, that's really interesting, and I think it's especially interesting for your kind of pivot and the interest that you perceived in moving from or being part of decision making, not just advocacy. I think that's really interesting, and I want to ask Maina Kiai, and Maina, who's a dear friend and former colleague. I love being on a panel with Maina because people would sort of mix up our names. We're like, brothers from another mother kind of thing. Maina, who is like Nigat in Pakistan, Maina is one of the leading human rights defenders in Kenya, served as the first chair of the Kenyan executive director of the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, and was special rapporteur for the UN on freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Maina, I want to ask you a similar question that I asked of Nigat, and given that you come from a kind of similar space, speaking truth to power in your entire career, what were your expectations going in, and how have you been surprised, if at all?
Thank you, David, and it's really good to see the rest of my colleagues who we only meet on internet. We've never actually met in person, sadly. So I think one of my surprises is that we have gone this far without actually shaking hands and looking at people's eye to eye and seeing whether they have as many wrinkles as I have. So that's been part of the surprises that this has gone on online as for so long. And I hope we can be able to get offline for a bit and be able to understand each other better. Just like Nigat, I mean, first of all, I was totally shocked when I was asked to be on this board. I didn't even know where the idea came from. I had a very healthy disregard of Facebook and arm's length relationship with them. I was critical of Facebook in public. I frankly didn't like the company, and I don't like the company. Keep saying I haven't changed my mind about that. I think it's a very dangerous enterprise in very many ways. It's too big, it's too rich, it's too powerful, and it's a corporate. And I have this view right now that one of the big dangers of our world is we've got to have corporate regulation. We've got to move away. We've got to have some more ways of putting the inequalities that are going on are just too much, and too much money and too much power is in too few hands, and that's always dangerous from a human rights lens. So I was kind of surprised when I was asked. Anyway, so going back and forth, and when I was eventually, I decided to say yes because it's an experiment, and I wanted to see if it works. And it's one thing to keep attacking and criticizing, another thing to be told, okay, so you try and fix it, try and be a player in fixing it. And I see the role very much as that of an internal auditor, internal financial auditor, and then the state and the people are the external auditors. The two do not go, are not in contradistinction. So I find that very interesting. I think very, very important. I hope this is a experiment that works. We still don't quite sure it will. I hope it works and it's expanded, but there's got to be some form of regulating and ensuring that human rights are protected from these big platforms. They have the future of the world. We've got to find a way to live with them in some form that makes sense to us and keeps us safe, as well as giving us the platform and the voice that we can have. I think the major surprises, I think, for me were well, first of all, how complex the decisions are. Sometimes you look at something from the outside and think, oh, this is very simple. Of course it should be stay on. Of course this should go down. But actually, it's a bit more complex than that as you go into it and you look into context and other stuff of it. It's a bit more complex. That I think was quite surprising. And that's been interesting. That you're gonna take this quite seriously and go slowly through the decision-making processes. I think the other surprise was the constant, or maybe not constant, but the occasional rise of First Amendment versus international human rights law, and which one goes where. And the Americans and their First Amendment. Yesterday, I'm sure you might have seen that article about the ACLU and whether the ACLU has lost its, in the New York Times, has lost its center of gravity by moving into progressive issues as opposed to being firmly First Amendment. Your right is your right, and that there's a big interesting debate that goes on between in the human rights world.
I think we got mine have paused right there. So why don't I move mine? I'm sorry if I don't know if you can hear me or not. That was really fascinating, and actually, you covered like 3/4 of the questions that I was planning to ask, but that's okay. We'll drill down into them.
Yeah, yeah. But the last thing is that, you know, when you work together in a panel, you find that whenever you work together in a panel, you find that you have to, the amount of compromises you have to make has been very interesting. That's it.
That's fantastic. And Mina, sorry if it seemed like I interrupted you. We lost you there for a second. So I want to sort of take from your comment and move to Evelyn. Now, Evelyn, I think anybody who does work in human rights and digital space knows the work of Evelyn Oswald, who's written extensively on human rights, on online rights, started her career in international law as a lawyer at the US State Department, is now a professor of law at the University of Oklahoma, and has done many, many other things, is really one of the leading American scholars and commentators on international human rights. And Evelyn, I want to ask, it's sort of a variation on the question of expectations and surprise, but maybe I could frame it in a way taking off from what Mina was suggesting about the nature of the discussions around, you know, sort of the complexity issue and the First Amendment human rights kinds of issues. And I wonder if, as you were going in to the board to taking on this role, what were your expectations? Maybe put another way, what were you hoping to accomplish by joining? And also on for the surprise kind of question, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the way that you have tried, which I imagine you've tried to do, I don't have any inside knowledge here, which is to really educate others who aren't necessarily human rights defenders or lawyers or scholars about how human rights should operate in this space. So if those two, sort of the expectation, and then, you know, how you've actually worked to integrate human rights in this, as Mina put it, experiment.
Yeah, well, thanks, David, and thank you for moderating the panel. And of course, thanks to RightsCon for another wonderful week of talks. Yeah, I was pretty open, you know, before joining the board about what I would hope it would do, and that was that it would take the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, a framework for how companies should respect human rights in their operations, that it would really espouse that framework and implemented it in its day-to-day work, which, you know, draws a lot, quite frankly, on your great work as a special rapporteur in terms of how private companies can moderate contact while respecting the scope of international human rights protections for freedom of speech and other rights. So that was my hope, and that was what I was writing to when they had consultations before launching the board. I wrote about these issues to Facebook, and I wrote articles about this, and you know, I didn't know if it would happen. I felt for years a bunch of us were going to conferences, waving the human rights law flag, and not getting too much traction. And I've been happy. It's been good to see that there has been an espousal of this framework and this these standards, these UN standards by the board. And I think if folks look at our decisions, you know, they'll see that we're quite rigorous in explaining how we see ourselves within that framework as a grievance mechanism, and how we apply those UN standards in each case. And we try to be very detailed about that. I have been a bit of, I would say, someone who tries to give the background explanation, as you mentioned in your question, just to share some of the research I've been doing in terms of freedom of expression norms at the UN. And you know, there's obviously the UN Human Rights Committee has a lot of guidance. You've issued a lot of guidance when you were the special rapporteur. Now we have a new rapporteur also issuing guidance. And I think there's actually a lot out there to guide us, and we are trying to filter it and apply it as best we can. And I hope that that I'm able to play a role in that process. And I would also give great kudos to our staff, which does tremendous research also to help us in this mandate of applying human rights standards to our work.
Great, Evelyn, thanks so much. I want to stick with you for a sort of a follow on there. And one of the sort of results of the debate around content moderation and the kind of high profile over the last 6 months, at least, that human rights has gained, in large part because of the work that the three of you are doing with the Oversight Board. What kind of pushback do you see? Because in scholarly settings, in panels, there's quite a bit of argument around, like, does human rights actually provide appropriate guidance? Does it provide enough? Is it rich enough? Mina described complexity. So it's a very complex area that you're dealing with. And sometimes law doesn't exactly match up. There might be some indeterminacy around it. What kind of pushback are you seeing? And what are the arguments that you find resonate with your other board members?
Well, I'm not going to discuss our internal discussions here necessarily, but the discussions that I've seen in terms of a reaction to the board's work, particularly in the US, are often, I think, as Mina touched on, kind of a reluctance about human rights law. And I think part of it is just a lack of background on what international human rights law is and how it works. I'm actually working on an article now comparing the First Amendment to human rights law to try to bridge those gaps so people can see, rather than make a judgment from a position of not understanding human rights law and kind of being reluctant about it. There are also scholars, as you've mentioned, who have voiced concerns that there isn't enough guidance in human rights law. And really, in the work that I'm doing in terms of accumulating all the the work that you've done, that the Human Rights Committee has done, there's just an enormous corpus of information, and it's just not presented in a very human rights way, or sorry, research friendly way on the UN website, quite frankly, and it takes kind of gathering it all together to be able to digest it. So I think that's part of the problem with understanding human rights law as a metrics. And also, I think that all of these cases, even with the application of human rights law, require judgment, right? Where's that line on incitement? Where is that line on what's improperly vague? Even with a lot of guidance, it requires judgment. And when we have people from all over the world with different expertise, different experiences in their lives, different concerns, it takes time to evaluate that. But that doesn't mean that human rights isn't working. I think it is still the guidepost that gets us to the final decisions. Great,
thanks for that. And by the way, the lowest hanging fruit in international human rights research is complaining about the OHCHR website. So I just want to acknowledge that issue. So I want to take us sort of from this kind of opening of expectations and surprises. This has been really great to hear sort of the path that you've all taken. Obviously, the board is doing some really interesting work, I think, around content moderation in particular, like how the rules actually apply to specific kinds of content, whether it's, insult and bullying, or it's incitement or something else. But of course, and this is a kind of a reflection on the recommendations that the board has proposed over the last several months, the ecosystem for information and rights online goes beyond decisions about what stays up and what comes down. And the board has made some really interesting recommendations to Facebook. And I just wanted to highlight a few of the recommendations from the Trump deplatforming case, where the board recommended, for example, more resources to assess the risks of particular content. You made a recommendation, or the board made a recommendation that Facebook should review its contribution to the narrative of electoral fraud in the United States, focusing on, and the quote here is, design and policy choices. And the board also made a recommendation that Facebook develop and publish policy that that governs Facebook's responses to crises. So you're obviously moving into this space that is well beyond sort of the strict, this content should come up and this content should stay down, or this account should be suspended or not. And I think that's very interesting. And I wanted to hear from you what you expect from Facebook in terms of its responses to your recommendations, and whether you think, and it's very early, I mean, I want to acknowledge that the Trump case is actually a recent decision of the Oversight Board. So you're probably still in the place of waiting to hear what Facebook says, but what do you expect Facebook to do in response? And have you felt that their reaction so far have been positive? Maybe start with you, Nigat.
Yeah, so David, I guess, first of all, I think the nature of cases that we have been looking into, definitely it's complex, and I think it also says a lot. The combination of board members says a lot about the diversity and the kind of like diverse sort of opinions we have during our deliberations. But I would say that I think that's also the beauty where we managed to tell each other that there is a world beyond the developed world and the First Amendment, and we really need to look into the other context and the other jurisdictions and the laws that people are not just fighting against the tech giants' policies, but also their local laws that are very, very problematic. So they have repressive regimes and then repressive policies by the tech giants. So I just wanted to say that around the complex nature of the decisions that we make. But at the same time, I guess board in its decisions have made it clear, they are binding decisions, but then we are giving recommendations to the company that these are the gaps that they can look into, and then to hold the company accountable, we'll be very transparent in our annual report that what they have done and what they haven't done so far. So I think that's all I want to say in terms of recommendations. But those recommendations come from comes from a diverse opinion of the panel members, and those opinions are not coming from just one jurisdiction, from several jurisdictions. And I think that's what something makes it sometimes complex, but also sometimes to me it's very satisfying that we also have power in those panel discussions where we can say, hold us at, there is something in my jurisdiction, so you really need to keep that in mind while making a decision for something very important.
So I want to stick with you here, Nigat, because this is a really interesting point that you're making about local law and the pressures that local law or national law can impose on users, on the platform. And I mean, I'll hop back to the bigger question with Mina in a second, but before I move on to that, do you think, so I'm in a way asking you to step outside of the oversight board function in a way, but not, because there is this recommendation aspect to it. What do you think, just maybe even thinking about Pakistan and the distance of the company from the lived experience of people in Pakistan, particularly online, what are the things that you want to see so that the company is more capable of observing human rights? I mean, is it resources? Is it better context? Is it more of a presence in the leadership of Facebook? What are those things to your mind?
I think, David, it's bits and pieces, all of these things. I think it's a lack of willingness when it comes to these jurisdictions, because as Mina said, it's a powerful, rich company. It's not that they don't have resources. It's not that they cannot look into these jurisdictions because COVID is here. I think it's the willingness and the will within the company that needs to change. And if removing the hat of board and a digital rights activist from Pakistan, I think some of the things that we have addressed in some of our decisions are also looking into the language, right? So regional languages is something that, we have been pushing the company to look into, not just Facebook, I would say like other companies also, but also at the same time, when it comes to local laws, speak to the users also. What they do, basically, they speak to the governments. And if the companies can find a space to speak to the governments, why they cannot, speak to the users or civil society based in these jurisdictions? I mean, what is hard in here? So I think these are the things that the companies really, especially Facebook, really need to look into. But I would also say, like, if I put my board hat, I think these are also the things we can also, like recommend in our decision and then hold the company accountable at the bigger level.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So let me sort of pop back to that point and ask Mina. Mina, I mean, you started off by saying, you have, like, maybe to put it diplomatically, you have some doubts about the company and some concerns about it. And now we're seeing the oversight board stepping into some of those spaces where I think your concern seems, relevant. How do you feel so far about the conversation that the board is having with Facebook? Obviously, it's not sort of an individual having a conversation with a policy person at the company, but are you sensing that the board is able to move into this space and positively influence these kind of bigger questions about the environment in which content decisions are made?
That's a great question. I think for me that the issue around the issue around the company is a question of power. How do those people who are powerless address and hold accountable those who have power? And so I think it's a natural progression. And I believe human rights, and maybe it's a very different approach than traditional human rights work, but I believe human rights, the work of human rights is to constantly expand the boundaries to hold accountable those who are in power, whether they're in government, the states, or they're in corporates, wherever they are. Or whether they're in the house, which is why domestic violence and women's human rights issues are important. How do we hold those who are in power accountable? So whichever way it is, whether it's through the content moderation or keep pushing and saying, you got to put more resources into content moderation. So it's not all automation. And remember as well that as we go through this debate is that that Facebook is registered and incorporated in the United States of America, but 85% of its users are outside North America. So how does it become? So it is actually more. It's got to figure out this. It's either going to be a US-based company that's doing international work, international clients, or it's going to be an international company and held to international law. So I suppose all those things are going to happen. I think, and when you hear the board talking about the third recommendation about design, it's a question of us we would like to understand how those algorithms work. We just, you don't know how to say it. How do they work? Because they may help us in our work, because as we're doing oversight over the content, how do we know how these algorithms work and which way? And then, of course, it's also the question about whether Facebook has got algorithms that perpetuate division and stress and incitement within there, which we don't know. So we ask the question, is anything inside the company that you're doing that is driving this traffic towards that then leads to all the crises and issues that are being raised against Facebook? So as a question on discovery, how do we move this process forward, and how do we have much more transparency within the company so everybody who's a user and not outside can actually understand where the company is going? So, and those are very legitimate human rights concerns, David. They may not be not seen as traditional, but they're very legitimate human rights concerns.
Yeah, and let me just ask you to follow up on the question of automation and AI. Those are complex questions, and they're complex for non-technologists and for technologists themselves. So, I mean, do you feel that you're getting, when you're asking questions about algorithmic recommendations or about what gets surfaced, or as is really relevant in the context of incitement, the reach, the audience that is attracted to and sees particular content, like how that all works, are you finding that you're getting explanation from the company to help you make those kinds of context decisions?
I think those issues are still ongoing. It's still a work in progress. We haven't yet come to a point where we know exactly what's been given, what's not been given. That process is ongoing with the staff that are looking at it. So I can't really answer the question. But I think that when we come to the year-end report, you will see a response to that question. What has the company said? What's happened since then? Has it helped us? And we'll see whether that happens. But right now, it's too early in the process to do that.
Great, thanks. So taking this issue, Evelyn, I want to ask you, so still sticking with this broader kind of approach that we see in the recommendations. I mean, it does seem that there's a kind of bifurcation. The decisions are very much, kind of rooted in the rules, the bylaws, the charter of the board, and then the recommendations, which are permitted, of course, under the bylaws, allow you a little bit more space to expand so that you have a better understanding of how this is all working in this whole ecosystem of content moderation and of sort of content sharing and so forth. What is the argument, or how do you see these issues? Particularly, maybe the example of automation is a good one. How do you see automation as a human rights issue? Like, what is the argument, in a way, that the board, because of its remit, should be paying attention to issues like automation, even when, automation might not deal with a particular kind of content or a particular post, but it's a broader question. What's the argument for that being within the human rights law framework?
Yeah, sure. I think the argument was made in one of our opinions recently that that analysis of design of automation is actually extremely relevant to the board's human rights law analysis, in terms of, we assess what Facebook is doing under the legality test, whether its rules are vague or not, whether they're imposing a restriction for a legitimate public interest objective. And then we look at necessity. And part of necessity is whether Facebook is using the least intrusive means to deal with a legitimate objective, to achieve a legitimate objective when it removes speech. And the first step in that analysis of whether a speech removal is the least intrusive means is indeed, how is it designed? What is it doing that itself in its architecture that maybe is causing the problem or exacerbating the problem? And we explained we need to know that information in order to assess if a removal or other punishment is the least intrusive means to achieve an objective. Just hearkening back to State Department days, when we used to look at that lens for state action, for governmental action, we often took the position it was inappropriate for governments to resort to censorial methods when they weren't doing anything in their own governance design to address issues of, for example, intolerance, violence, etc. But they immediately resorted to censoring before looking and seeing what they could do to deal with these issues. So it's an analogy from that time, and that's how the board has phrased it in a recent opinion.
That's great. Thanks, Evelyn. I think that's really a nice articulation of sort of the broader framework of human rights and how it plays out here. Let me sort of move us slightly into a different direction. I want to emphasize, anybody who is listening, who's watching this panel, please feel free to submit a question. However we submit questions, I can't really explain how that works, but we will get the question, I promise. So if you have a question, please do submit it so it can be part of our conversation. I want to go to an issue of sort of taking the oversight board experience, and we may come back to some specifics about the board, but I want to ask you all sort of two separate questions. Let me start with the first one, which is more specific to the oversight board, and that is the nature of the interaction with Facebook when you request information. So you've done this a few times, I think. You've asked for information, and sometimes Facebook, the company, will say, no, we can't submit that kind of information, or they'll make the argument that it's not relevant to your decision. How is that worked out? I mean, is there any sense that you have that Facebook, given the fact that this is self-regulatory, there's no outside court that's going to enforce any judgment. The whole system is designed on kind of this good faith process and commitment that the company has made. And to a certain extent, is there a sense that you would like the company to say more when you ask for information? Are you generally pretty satisfied with the level of information, the kind of information that you're getting from the company to help you make the decisions? I realize it's kind of a sharp question in a certain way, but I think the tenor of your discussion so far has suggested that the board, and you in particular, are eager to push the company to provide as much information so that you can make accurate calls on these things. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in to answer that question first.
Evelyn is our professor, so she's good at this, so she can start us off.
Mina, thanks for volunteering me. So I would say, looking back at all our decisions, we do make clear in our opinions when when Facebook has not answered the questions. And we try to be transparent about that we asked for certain information and that they would not provide it or said it was irrelevant, et cetera. So hopefully at least that transparency with the public put some pressure on Facebook to keep that information coming, hopefully in the future. And we will certainly be issuing a transparency report in which we will discuss these issues more in depth. And, in addition, we have implementation working team that is really looking at Facebook to see when it's implementing and how it's doing its work. And that too will be in the transparency report. So, I think you've hit on an important issue, the fact that Facebook does not often or always answer our questions, but that we are trying to be as transparent about that as possible and make sure the public knows when that happens. And we'll be issuing more formal views on that in a transparency report.
Great. That's great to hear. Yes,
can
please.
I add on this a little bit? I think the beauty of this experiment is that the reputation of Facebook is at risk in terms of how it responds to the board and how it responds to us. And our reputation as board members is at risk depending on how we work and how we don't decide. And so it's kind of nice that even though there's no court that is going to make a decision beyond us, there are all these reputational risks that we are both involved in, which I think helps us and hopefully helps Facebook become better at what it's doing. Because I see part of this, the process of us is us limiting and reducing Facebook's power, at least in content moderation, and then in some other aspects that affect content moderation. You really can't talk about content moderation or talk about algorithms and how traffic is driven and how ads up. You really can't. At some point, you'll have to get there. So I think we are getting there. It's early days. We will see how it goes in the next 5-7 years and see whether it's a useful experiment or not. But it's good in that sense because all of us, at least I know members of the board who are really, really careful about our reputations. We don't want to go in and be swallowed in by this corporate giant, and then we're told this has happened to us. So we're all nervous about that. But on the other hand, so we want to do a good job, but you don't want to be taken for a fig leaf. We don't want to be the fig leaves for this company. No, and so it's an interesting place where you're at. Yeah.
Right. That's really interesting. And we're friends. We can pretend that like nobody's listening to us for a moment. And I'll tell you what the question is in my mind, and you could tell me how or whether you want to answer it, because it's a kind of abstract question in a way. Your reputations matter. You're all, and I don't think any of you have anything to worry about there. You're all known as independent-minded human rights defenders and scholars. Is there something that you can imagine, and if it doesn't have to be specific, but is there a category of Facebook response or category of Facebook behavior that would really give you pause about staying on the board? right? Because you know what you've described, and this is what, you know, we started with your expectations and things that were surprising, and I thought it was very interesting to hear that you all sort of joined this as an experiment to see if this self-regulatory model can work to restrain some of the some of the activities of a company that have a pretty massive and often deleterious impact on human rights, a negative impact on human rights. Is there something where you'd say, you know what, I'm going to move on to my other activities, devote more time to other things, and leave the board? Is there like a category? I mean, it wouldn't be specific to a case, but is there something that would give you pause, or that you think about? I imagine you thought about that when deciding to join the board too. Anybody want to try to answer that question?
You know, sometimes they say, David, that you'll know it when you see it, you know, but you know, you'll know it when you see it. It's kind of hard to explain what it would be, but it would be perhaps a decision by Facebook, or even by the board, by the way, that is so egregiously violating the principles we have, that it would make, you know, first, there were quite a few people who thought that the Trump decision was existential for the board. And you know, what happened after that decision? We had 3 days of news, and then it all filtered out. And then now Facebook has announced their decision. 2 days of news is filtered out. So, you know, who knows what the issue will be that's existential, that makes you say, okay, that's it. I don't know. I mean, you'll see when you will know it when you see it, I suppose, is the best way I can say.
Yeah, great. You got it?
I would also say, David, I think it's too early to say something about an experiment. I mean, that at least that's how I, decided to join the board, keeping in mind that how long it can take to, see the results of the decisions that we will make in the, in the oversight board. So yeah, I think for me, it's, and even before the panel, we were talking about, the whole process. For me, it's like learning about so many things, like the discriminatory policies of the company that I have been talking about for almost a decade now. I mean, I learned so much, went into the depth around those policies, values that we discussed, even your reports, the different aspects of the human rights framework that we discussed, and then contextualizing those. I mean, even when you were, producing reports, we were also the ones from Pakistan, submitting our, documents to you and bringing conversation into the. I think this is something that we are learning, how to contextualize the international human rights framework and look beyond the, like developed jurisdictions, or let's say just, like look beyond First Amendment, I would say.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So let me step to a slightly different kind of question. And you've all been talking about this self-regulatory. We've been talking about this self-regulatory mechanism, but there's this separate conversation, actually conversations that are taking place worldwide, right? One question sort of focuses on regulation, and we see like very active discussions about this, whether we're talking about Brussels or Washington or Delhi or Islamabad. I mean, everywhere, Nairobi, everywhere, the discussion is around what regulation should be imposed in order to restrain or constrain Facebook and the other large platforms. Meanwhile, there's a separate conversation about other forms of oversight, right? Somewhere in between the self-regulatory model and the cross-industry model. And I wonder if, like, with these conversations taking place, whether there are things that you're taking away from the oversight board that that help you understand where it can fit in these other conversations. So maybe to ask it in a more specific way, and Evelyn, I'll start with you to ask you this question. Are there lessons that you're taking away from the oversight board that could apply to cross-industry oversight? Things like, Article 19's social media council idea, or to other kinds of ideas that draw from the example of press councils around the world. Are there things that you're learning that you think would be applicable to that space? And maybe even another way to put it is there anything about this self-regulatory model that might actually interfere with those kinds of processes?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question. And I guess if we're working on developing social media councils today, some lessons that I might apply would be, it's useful if the companies pledge in advance to respect human rights law in their content moderation and conduct an internal audit to try to align themselves before joining. I think that would be a very helpful launching pad for a social media council, to have the companies that sign up make the pledge and make an attempt to align ahead of time. In terms of lessons for maybe broader regulation like this, I mean, I still see things through the lens of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So, we're the second pillar of the company trying to respect human rights and creating a grievance mechanism. But the first pillar of the UN Guiding Principles is states regulating to protect individuals from harms by other third parties, right? So that space for regulation is maintained in the UN Guiding Principles. And I guess the lesson I would draw from serving on the board is that I think a useful space for regulation is with respect to automated techniques, algorithms, at the very least, more transparency about how companies collect personal data and monetize it and then deploy it. I think that is a space very ripe for regulation. When I see intermediary liability laws, however, that require 24-hour takedowns of violative content, that I think is a very dangerous space for regulation, especially when I see the amount of work we put into deciding if something is hate speech that should be removed or not, is incitement that should be removed or not. I think placing that 24-hour, 48-hour burden on companies is just going to result in an overreach of incentives to take down too much. So I guess those are my kind of initial lessons from a year on the board.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Mina, can I ask you this question as well? I mean, when you, in your initial response to my first question, you identified regulation as something that you think should be taking place. Of course, in Kenya, there have been forms of regulation. They tend to not be the most, infused with human rights principles all the time. But there is a real demand in Kenya as elsewhere for real transparency. Do you see a kind of a role for the oversight board in promoting good regulation? Is this something that you're seeing develop as part of the conversation? Certainly the conversation outside of the US and Europe. Are you seeing the conversation move in a helpful direction, at least in part because of what the oversight board is doing?
I think it's a bit early. It's a bit early to say that. I think people are watching, people are reading, people are trying to figure out what this animal called oversight board is really about. Is it a useful approach to try and emulate and spread across parts of the world? I think the overreach is the worrying thing about regulation. Always is overreach, but then the other side of it is no regulation and we have a mess. So you've got to find that happy balance that exists. I don't know. I mean, I think it's where I come from, I worry about overreach by the state, and then when I see the US, I worry about over there's too much space without any regulation. So that's the balance. So I think just looking at it, I think social media is important and is going to grow. So we have got to find ways in which we have to grow with it in terms of regulation, whether it's how do you do this human rights? I suppose if you ask me what is the one thing I would advise anybody coming together, is that they would have to read all of David Kaye's reports on social media and freedom of expression and try and implement them and use that as a guideline, even beyond others. But I think what Evelyn said as well is very important. We've also got to look at surveillance, the surveillance capitalism that exists. That's a fundamental. I think if we don't touch surveillance capitalism, we're not touching much more. So it's the center of it all, and it's got to be addressed.
That's really interesting because, of course, sort of the business model of the companies is not squarely within the oversight board's remit. Although, again, looking back at some of the recommendations, you're clearly thinking in that space. So that's really interesting. I want to ask Nigat a question that is a little bit different from this one around regulation, although you're welcome to answer that one too. But I want to ask you, so we probably, I'm assuming we have quite a number of people on the panel who are watching the panel or listening, who are interested in, how do they influence the work of the oversight board? And the board, obviously in the context of the Trump case, there were something like 9,000 comments that were submitted. What are the ways in which advocates can be most helpful in working with or communicating with or providing their advocacy to the oversight board? Are you finding that there are certain kinds of techniques or substantive issues that outside advocates and scholars might be bringing to the board that are particularly helpful?
Yeah, so David, I would like to respond to your regulation question and
Yeah.
also as a digital rights activist, not as a board member. I think lots of governments are coming up with the regulations around regulating content, internet in their own jurisdictions and pushing these companies to follow what they are making in terms of local laws. And when it comes to board in our charter, our scope is that, local laws will supersede, like our decisions. So you see, we cannot really, influence what the local laws say, or cannot really go into that space, at least for now. And I think that's where I see the role of, different mechanisms, different civil society organization and tech companies, as Evelyn said, that, make a pledge, what exactly they will be going to do when it comes to the governments where they have economic interest, where they have political, like influence, like there is a political influence that, can be used with the company, especially in jurisdictions where there is a fear of, blatant censorship and blocking of these platforms. So I really think that platforms, tech giants, not just Facebook, all of them really need to think through how they are going to respond to these regulation regime that is coming up and it's being discussed in different jurisdictions. I can say in Pakistan and India, that is the hot debate at the moment. But to your second question, which I forgot, if you can.
Well, actually, before we get to the second question, then let me follow up with this point that you're making, because I think you're making a really important one. And earlier you also talked about local law. So local law regulation. I mean, we might, when we say regulation, it might give the sense that, oh, it's all within this rule of law framework, and it's just about providing democratic accountability for the companies, which would be great. But you're also talking about, the real kind of pressure that local law, that governments are putting, and not just through law, but through extra legal mechanisms, which as well as anybody. So given that, like, what do you see as the space for the oversight board to actually improve the way the companies deal with those legal pressures from governments? So, it's one of those spaces that I think the company itself says that's outside your remit. And yet, as we see in India, for example, over the last couple of months, demands from governments are extremely consequential for public debate. And it puts the company in a position of, well, how do we respond? So how do you see the oversight board in this kind of complex dynamic between the state, the individual, and the company?
So David, I guess we really shouldn't expect everything from the oversight board to respond. Like the companies have lots of issues, and I think oversight board has been established to address content moderation. When it comes to states and local laws, I think companies also really need to figure out, like how they are going to respond, because they have an obligation under the international law as well. Oversight board is giving, besides the binding decisions that they are making, they are giving recommendations in the policy guidelines. And I think that's something that advocates and civil society organizations really need to look into the nitty-gritty of the decisions that we are making, because we are putting a lot of labor into writing those decisions and then looking into different aspects of the international human rights framework. So I'm not sure if I have responded to your question, but at least that's how I see this.
Well, I know you have absolutely responded to it. I guess, one way of thinking about local law and governmental pressure is also as a form of content moderation, right? And the companies have a couple of different responses to that. I mean, one response that we've seen in some places is the company will essentially integrate into their terms of service and their rules the local law, so that it looks like the company is actually doing its own kind of self-governance, but in fact, it's implementing government policy. And I'm not sure if there's a question that follows from this, although Mina, you raised regulation earlier. I wonder if you can imagine, a space where you're actually having influence, sort of assessing that dynamic itself.
That is one of the hardest things, David, that I suppose, not even for us, not for the oversight board, but I suppose what goes on for everybody who's pushing for human rights and freedom of expression across the world. How does a company deal with a government, an authority that is demanding that anything that is critical of government be pulled out, and how do you deal with it? And does the work of the oversight board have any influence at all? You would hope so. You would hope that activists will be citing and say, look, let's use the oversight board as our moderator as opposed to using government operations. And sometimes the companies succumb. We've seen that happening in India, as you say, and sometimes in Turkey, where the companies are succumbing to the authorities. So I think this battle, this struggle, this contestation between the authoritarian states and freedom of expression, writ large, not just on the platforms, will continue, and it's been going on for years, even before social media, with the mainstream media, when governments would order newspapers and radio to say certain things. So I suppose this is where the struggle will continue. The contestation continues. I don't think it's any different from that. And what is painful is when the social media companies just roll over and accept, and there's no discussion, there's no transparency. Sometimes it's even good for them to say, look, we have been asked by the government of the United States to drop all these things. It's much better if they say that, and then people can have their own debate. It may help move that discussion forward.
That's great. So we've only got 2 minutes left, and then I think we just go dark, and I think that just happens like automatically mid-sentence. So I want to conclude with the last question that I was asking Nighat, and it's really just a straightforward question as to what kind of advocacy, what kind of input, may not even be advocacy, but what kind of input would be most useful to you as board members moving forward? I mean, you do have this, there's a sense, you're not a court, but you have some of the bells and whistles of a court, in the sense that you have an interaction with other panelists, you have interaction with the company, with individuals who make submissions. What should advocates be thinking? And you've only got 20 seconds to give here's what we need from civil society in their input. I know, Evelyn, if you want to start with that.
Sure. I mean, I would say, please participate in the public comments process for each decision that we face. It's hugely helpful to be able to see what a range of experts and individuals are thinking. And people now know and are familiar with our template, how we write our opinions. So plugging into those issues that we will have to decide for a particular case based on how we write the opinions, how we evaluate the human rights aspects is great. And on a more maybe a detailed scale, I would say for civil society actors that really follow these issues, I think you really need to make room in your point of contacts portfolio, right? To handle this, because it's kind of a growing part of the portfolio that can overwhelm one person. So I would say be thinking strategically about how to be a consistent participator in our public comments process.
Thanks, Evelyn. Nigat, Mina, just like a quick word before we go dark here.
Yeah, actually what Evelyn said, but we need more contribution from Global South from our own jurisdictions.
Great, thanks. And Mina?
I have nothing more and nothing further to add. I think Nigata said it all. We just need much more people from the Global South participating, raising questions, being as critical of us as we expect. I think the more criticism we have, the better it is for the board, to be honest.
That's a fantastic point to end on here. Evelyn, Nigat, Mina, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I hope our audience has as well. It's great to see you next time in person. I really hope, and stay well, stay healthy, and to everybody who's watching, thanks so much. Thanks for your questions as well, which had such an impact here. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, David.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.